I used to believe that if you cared about someone enough, showed up enough, stayed patient enough, they'd eventually feel it too. I held on to that belief far longer than I want to admit, and it cost me more than time. It cost me the version of myself that used to trust his own instincts, the version that could look at a situation clearly instead of talking himself into whatever hurt the least. I'm not telling you that so you feel sorry for me. I'm telling you because somewhere in the next few minutes, you're going to recognize yourself. And when you do, I want you to trust what you see instead of arguing with it the way I did for far too long. Here's what nobody tells you about disinterest. It's rarely loud. It doesn't usually announce itself with a clear sentence you can point back to later. A woman who isn't interested in you almost never says so directly, not because she's cruel, but because most people would rather let something fade quietly than sit through an uncomfortable conversation they don't feel obligated to have. So instead of a clear answer, you get something quieter and far more confusing. You get almost enough. Almost enough attention to keep hoping. Almost enough warmth to keep waiting. Almost enough effort to convince yourself you're reading the whole thing wrong. And almost enough is exactly where men lose years of their lives, one reasonable explanation at a time. This isn't a video about giving up on people too quickly, and it's not about treating every quiet moment as rejection. Some people are simply slow, or private, or bad at kepsting, and none of that means disinterest on its own. What this video is about is pattern recognition, learning to read what's actually being shown to you consistently over time, instead of what you're hoping to see in any single moment. Today, I'm walking you through 10 things a woman consistently does when she isn't interested, and just as importantly, why she does them, because understanding the why is what stops you from taking it personally and starts you rebuilding your own judgment instead of outsourcing it to hope. Let's get into it. Sign number 1. Her replies feel like maintenance, not connection. There's a difference between someone responding to you and someone reaching toward you, and most men never learn to tell the two apart until it's already cost them something. A reply can exist purely to close a loop. Fine, that's funny. Sounds good. Technically a response. Emotionally, nothing. It answers the message without extending the conversation, without asking a follow-up question, without leaving a door open for you to keep talking. When someone is genuinely drawn to you, their replies don't just answer, they invite. They ask what happened next. They bring their own energy into it instead of simply returning yours back to you, each time slightly diminished. So here's the question worth asking yourself honestly, without softening it. When she responds to you, does the conversation grow, or does it just end politely, one closed loop at a time? Message after message, week after week. If it's the second one, you're not being ignored, which would almost be easier to understand. You're being maintained, and maintenance is what people give to things they don't want to lose completely, but also don't feel moved to invest in. That's not confusion on her part. That's a fairly clear answer, delivered gently enough that it rarely feels like one until you name it out loud.
There's a reason this particular sign is so easy to miss. And it's worth understanding instead of just noticing. A reply, any reply, triggers the same small relief in your brain, regardless of what's actually inside it. You see the notification, you see her name, and for half a second, your nervous system registers connection before your mind has even read the words. That relief is real, but it isn't information about her. It's a reaction to the notification itself, and it's exactly what keeps men reading warmth into responses that were never actually warm to begin with. The fix isn't to stop feeling that relief. It's to slow down long enough to ask what the message actually did, not just how getting it felt. Sign number 2. She never rearranges her life for you. People love to say they're busy, and most of the time it's technically true. But busy was never really the signal worth watching. Rearranging is the signal. Everyone, no matter how full their schedule genuinely is, has made room at some point for something that mattered enough to them. A friend in crisis gets a phone call at midnight, even after a 16-hour shift. A family emergency gets full attention, no matter what else was planned that day. Interest doesn't ask whether there's room in the schedule. Interest makes room, sometimes inconveniently, sometimes at a real cost, because the thing on the other side felt worth it. So when she consistently can't find 20 minutes for you, but somehow finds time for everything else moving through her life, you're not watching a scheduling problem. You're watching a priority list, and you're somewhere well below the visible line on it. Here's the part that stings the most, and it's worth sitting with instead of rushing past. She's probably not lying about being busy. She's just not busy enough to make an exception for you specifically. And that absence of exception is the actual information, far more than the words she uses to explain it. If you've ever caught yourself rearranging your entire week around a maybe from someone who's never once rearranged theirs, write maybe in the comments, because you already know exactly what I'm describing, and you've probably known it for longer than you've admitted. There's a quieter version of this same sign, one that's easy to miss because it doesn't look like busyness at all. It's the woman who's never technically unavailable, who always seems to have time on paper, but somehow that time never quite turns into anything concrete. Plans stay soft and undefined. We'll figure it out. Let's see how the week goes. Nothing ever actually lands on a calendar. That vagueness isn't an accident either. Definite plans require a small act of commitment, and commitment is exactly the thing someone withholds when they'd rather keep an option open than close one down. Watch how quickly plans turn solid the moment she actually wants something to happen, and compare that to how easily they dissolve into nothing when she doesn't. The difference will tell you more than the calendar itself ever could.
Sign number 3. She keeps you out of her future plans. Pay attention to how someone talks about time that hasn't happened yet, because it reveals more than almost anything they say about the present. When people are building something with you, even loosely, even early on, their language includes you without thinking about it. We should go there sometime. You'd like this place. I'll take you. I want you to meet my friends eventually. These aren't grand promises. They're small, unconscious placements of you inside a future she's already imagining without meaning to reveal that she's imagining it at all. Now notice the absence of that pattern. If every plan she describes, the trip she wants to take, the apartment she's looking at, the goals she's chasing next year, exists in a version of her life where you're simply never mentioned, that's not an oversight on her part. People don't accidentally leave out the person they're falling for. You only get quietly left out of a future someone hasn't pictured you standing inside of. And no amount of good behavior in the present rewrites a future she's never once included you in. Sign number 5. Her curiosity about you never deepens. In the beginning, almost everyone asks a few questions. It's polite, it's expected, and honestly, it barely means anything on its own. What actually matters is whether that curiosity grows over time or simply stays exactly where it started, frozen at the same shallow depth week after week. Real interest isn't satisfied with surface answers. It wants the version underneath the answer. Why do you actually think that? What was that like for you at the time? What are you scared of? Even the parts you don't usually say out loud. It follows up days later. It remembers what you mentioned 3 weeks ago and brings it back up unprompted because it actually stuck with her. But when the questions never move past small talk, when she knows your job title but not what you actually want out of your life, when weeks pass and she still knows less about you than a coworker would after one lunch, that's not shyness on her part. That's the emotional equivalent of stopping at the front door and never once being invited any further in. People memorize the details of what they're falling for. They don't just politely tolerate hearing about it while waiting for their turn to talk. Sign number 5. Her warmth in public, distant in private. This one confuses men more than almost anything else on this list, because on the surface it looks like the opposite of disinterest. She's affectionate when there are people around. She laughs a little louder, stands a little closer, seems genuinely happy to have you nearby. But the second it's just the two of you, something shifts. Subtly at first, then unmistakably. The warmth cools by several degrees.
The conversation slows down and starts requiring effort. The energy that felt so easy in front of others suddenly feels like work neither of you signed up for. Here's why that happens, and it's not what most men instinctively assume. Public warmth often isn't about you specifically at all. It's about comfort in a social moment, about being an easy, pleasant presence in a room, about a personality that simply performs well around other people regardless of who's standing next to her. Private connection is the real test, because private connection requires her to be interested in you specifically, not in the atmosphere of the moment you both happen to be standing in. When the warmth disappears the instant the audience does, you're not watching inconsistency or mixed signals. You're watching the difference between social comfort and a genuine desire to be close to you. And those two things can look almost identical from a distance while meaning something entirely different up close.
Let me walk you through how this actually plays out, because it's easy to misread if you've never seen it named clearly before. There was a guy in an online community I followed for a while. I'll call him Theo, who spent close to a year convinced a woman in his friend group was into him. At every gathering, she gravitated toward him, teased him in front of everyone, made him feel like the center of whatever room they were in. But every single time he suggested getting coffee, just the two of them, something always came up. Always reasonable on its own, never once reasonable in aggregate. Every one-on-one text eventually trailed off into silence, while the group chat version of her stayed exactly as warm and playful as ever, completely unaffected. It took him embarrassingly long to notice the pattern, mostly because the group warmth kept quietly resetting his hope every single time it happened, like a small deposit that made the whole account feel fuller than it actually was. What finally shifted things for him wasn't a conversation or a confrontation. It was simply watching, for once, instead of interpreting in his own favor. He realized her warmth had never once followed him out of a crowded room, not a single time across an entire year of gatherings. And once he let himself see that clearly, without softening it, he stopped waiting for a version of her that had only ever existed with an audience present. That's usually the actual trigger point for men in this exact situation. Not a dramatic rejection, just the quiet moment you finally let yourself see the pattern instead of explaining it away one more time. Sign number 6. She lets conflict go unresolved without urgency. This one is quiet, but it tells you almost everything about where you actually stand once you notice it. When something feels off between two people who genuinely care about each other, at least one of them usually feels an itch to fix it, sometimes uncomfortably so. A slightly cold conversation gets addressed within a day or two. A misunderstanding gets a follow-up text, even an awkward one. Nobody who's genuinely comfortable in a connection they value lets tension just sit there indefinitely, gathering dust unspoken. But when she can go days, sometimes weeks, entire stretches of time with something unresolved between you, and it clearly doesn't seem to bother her at all, that discomfort you're carrying isn't mutual, it's just yours. Urgency to repair a connection is one of the most honest signals people give off, precisely because it's involuntary and hard to fake convincingly for long. You can't manufacture the itch to fix something you don't actually feel at risk of losing. Notice, too, what usually happens in the reverse direction. If you're the one who brings up the tension, does she engage with it seriously, or does she smooth it over quickly just to move the conversation somewhere more comfortable? Smoothing something over isn't the same as resolving it. One requires her to sit in mild discomfort long enough to actually address what's wrong. The other just requires her to say enough of the right words to end the conversation. People who are genuinely invested tend to tolerate the first kind of discomfort because the relationship on the other side of it feels worth the friction. People who aren't invested default to the second option almost every time because there's nothing on the other side worth sitting through friction for. Sign number 7. Her silence doesn't cost her anything. This is the one that ties everything else together, and it might be the most important pattern in this entire video, so stay with me here. When someone genuinely wants you in their life, pulling back from them costs them something real. They feel the absence in small, specific ways. They notice the gap where your messages used to be. They eventually reach back out even if pride makes them slow and clumsy about it, because the silence itself becomes uncomfortable for them too, not just for you. But watch closely what happens when you go quiet with someone who was never really invested to begin with. Nothing happens. No follow-up message, no "what happened to you, are you okay?" No sign that your absence registered as a loss of any kind. Her life simply continues exactly as it was before, undisturbed, because you were never actually load-bearing in it to begin with, however much weight you were quietly carrying on your own end. That's not cruelty, and it's not even really about you personally. It's just math. You can't miss weight you were never actually holding up in the first place. Sign number 8. She rarely mentions you to people who aren't already in the room. Think about how differently people talk about someone they're excited about versus someone who's simply present in their life. When a person is genuinely into you, your name comes up when you're not there to hear it. A friend finds out about you before ever meeting you. A sibling asks how things are going with the guy she keeps bringing up. That happens naturally, without effort, because you're occupying space in her thoughts even when you're not occupying space in the room. But if the only time your existence comes up is when you're physically standing next to her, that's worth noticing. It means you're part of her present moment, but not yet part of the story she's telling about her own life. People talk about what excites them, unprompted, to anyone who listen. If you only exist in conversation when you're the one holding it up, you're not being hidden exactly. You're just not yet something she reaches for when you're not around. Sign number 9. She acknowledges your feelings without ever adjusting anything because of them. This is a subtler one, and it fools a lot of men because it looks like emotional maturity on the surface. You bring something up, something that's actually bothering you, and she responds, "Well, that makes sense. I hear you. I get why that would feel that way." All the right words said with what sounds like real understanding. But then nothing changes. The same pattern repeats the following week and gets the same understanding response, and nothing shifts again. Here's the distinction worth holding on to. Acknowledgement costs nothing. It's a sentence. Adjustment costs something, even if it's small, because it requires a person to actually change behavior on your behalf. When someone values you, being told you're hurting creates friction in them, and that friction shows up as change, even imperfect change. When someone is simply being polite, being told you're hurting produces the correct words and nothing underneath them. Watch what happens after the understanding, not during it. That's where the real answer usually lives.
Sign number 10. Nothing about how she treats you carries any romantic charge. This last one is less about a specific behavior and more about a feeling underneath all the others, but it's worth naming directly because it ties the whole pattern together. Attraction, even quiet, even early, tends to leak out in small, involuntary ways. A slightly longer glance, a comment about how you look that wasn't necessary to say, a little more nervousness in her voice than the situation calls for. None of that requires boldness on her part. It just requires actual interest, because interest is difficult to fully suppress even when someone wants to keep things casual. So ask yourself honestly whether anything in how she treats you has ever carried that charge, or whether the entire dynamic has stayed pleasant, friendly, and completely flat the whole way through. Flat isn't neutral. Flat is usually the answer, just delivered in a tone too calm to notice at the time. If you've made it this far and you're already mentally listing which of these applies to your situation, comment the number 1 through 10 that hit hardest. I want to see which one shows up the most. If any part of this list just made something click into place that you've been quietly talking yourself out of for weeks, maybe months, tell me which sign it was. I read every comment, and I promise you're not the only one who needed to hear it named out loud today. Here's the part almost nobody says clearly enough, so let me say it plainly. None of this makes her a bad person, and it definitely doesn't make you a fool for hoping in the first place. Hope isn't naive. Hope is simply what happens when you care about someone and haven't yet let yourself look directly at the evidence sitting right in front of you. But there's a real difference between giving someone patience and quietly giving someone permission to keep you waiting indefinitely without ever committing to anything real. You are allowed to want reciprocity. You are allowed to notice without guilt when it isn't there. and you are allowed to walk away from something that was never actually going to arrive without needing her to confirm that out loud first. If you've spent the last several minutes recognizing your own situation somewhere inside these 10 signs, I want you to sit with that for a moment, instead of immediately trying to fix it, explain it away, or find the one exception that lets you keep hoping anyway. Awareness almost always feels heavier than hope does, at least for the first few days. That weight is normal, and it passes faster than you'd expect. But it's also the only place real change has ever actually started from, for you or for anyone else watching this right now. You stop rearranging your life around someone else's maybe, and you start rebuilding it around your own standards instead, quietly, without announcing it to anyone. That single shift changes more than any amount of extra effort, patience, or waiting ever could have. So here's what I actually want you to walk away with today. Stop measuring her interest by what she says, and start measuring it by what she consistently shows you when nothing is being asked of her, when there's no audience, no pressure, no reason to perform anything at all. The words were never really the problem here. The pattern always was, quietly running underneath every conversation the whole time. And now you know exactly what to look for the next time it shows up. If this gave you something real to think about today, go ahead and subscribe. We cover psychology and relationships like this every single week. No fluff, just patterns worth actually noticing. And before you go, drop a comment telling me which of these 10 signs hit closest to home. I read every single one of them. Whatever you decide from here, decide it because you finally saw clearly, not because you're still hoping to be proven wrong.